Cuauhtémoc's last stand, when heroes choose honor over survival. The young eagles rise. In the smoke-filled council chambers of a dying empire where the last noble voices of Aztec resistance gathered beneath murals depicting their ancestors' greatest triumphs, 25-year-old Prince Cuauhtémoc stood before the assembled lords of Tenochtitlan and delivered the words that would define his reign and seal his fate. Better to die with honor as free men than to live as slaves beneath foreign masters who desecrate our temples and mock our gods. The prince whose name meant descending eagle had been born into a world already trembling on the edge of transformation, his childhood shadowed by strange omens and his youth shaped by rumors of bearded strangers from across the eastern sea who possessed weapons that thundered like storms and rode creatures that were neither deer nor any known animal. Unlike his uncle Moctezuma II, who had sought to understand these mysterious visitors through diplomacy and accommodation, Cuauhtémoc represented a new generation of Aztec leadership that viewed compromise with the Spanish invaders as impossible and resistance unto death as the only honorable response to existential threat. The young prince had witnessed the catastrophic sequence of events that had brought his empire to the brink of destruction: the Spanish seizure of Moctezuma, the massacre at the Templo Mayor during the Festival of Tenochtitlan, the humiliating retreat of the conquistadors during La Noche Triste, and the devastating return of Cortés with overwhelming indigenous allies who had turned against Aztec rule. Each episode had convinced Cuauhtémoc that the Spanish sought not merely tribute or territory, but the complete eradication of Aztec civilization and the substitution of their own god and customs for everything that had given meaning to Mesoamerican life for over a millennium. The military experience that prepared Cuauhtémoc for his final role as emperor warrior had been gained during the most desperate phase of imperial resistance, when traditional Aztec military doctrine was proving inadequate against European tactics and technology, while the empire's tributary system collapsed under the pressure of epidemic disease and Spanish-encouraged rebellion. The young prince had commanded defensive operations along the causeways, connecting Tenochtitlan to the mainland, while learning bitter lessons about the limitations of traditional weapons against steel armor and gunpowder, while discovering that courage and determination could sometimes overcome technological disadvantage through superior numbers and intimate knowledge of local terrain. The succession crisis that elevated Cuauhtémoc to imperial authority reflected the devastating impact that conquest and disease had inflicted upon Aztec political institutions, as the traditional nobility had been decimated by warfare, epidemic illness, and Spanish execution of potential leaders who might organize effective resistance. The death of Cuauhtémoc, Moctezuma's brother and chosen successor, after only 80 days of rule, left the empire without experienced leadership while facing the greatest military challenge in its history, creating circumstances that required the elevation of younger leaders whose primary qualification was their unwavering commitment to resistance regardless of personal cost. The imperial election that confirmed Cuauhtémoc as Huitlatoani took place in late 1520 or early 1521 under conditions that bore little resemblance to the elaborate ceremonies that had traditionally surrounded such momentous transitions in political authority. The ceremony was conducted hastily in a city already under siege pressure, while the imperial regalia had been destroyed or captured by Spanish forces during previous conflicts, forcing the new emperor to accept authority without the sacred objects that normally validated royal legitimacy and connected earthly rule to cosmic sanction. The political philosophy that guided Cuauhtémoc's approach to imperial leadership emphasized the sacred duty of rulers to preserve their people's freedom and cultural identity, even at the cost of their own lives, while rejecting any compromise that would preserve political power through accommodation with forces seeking to destroy the spiritual foundations of Aztec civilization. This uncompromising stance reflected both personal conviction and strategic assessment that Spanish demands were ultimately incompatible with any meaningful form of indigenous autonomy or cultural survival. The religious dimensions of Cuauhtémoc's resistance included his role as protector of sacred traditions and cosmic order against foreign influences that threatened to disrupt the fundamental relationships between human communities and divine forces that sustained both earthly prosperity and spiritual meaning. The young emperor understood his military struggle as simultaneously political and religious conflict in which defeat would mean not merely loss of territory or tribute, but the elimination of the cosmic relationships that connected Aztec society to universal purposes and divine protection. The age factor that distinguished Cuauhtémoc from previous emperors created both advantages and disadvantages for his leadership during the final crisis, as his youth provided physical energy and emotional resilience for sustained resistance, while his lack of administrative experience and established political relationships limited his ability to negotiate complex alliance systems or implement sophisticated diplomatic strategies that might have prolonged imperial survival through alternative approaches. The personality characteristics that defined Cuauhtémoc's approach to leadership included unwavering courage, inflexible principle, and romantic idealism that inspired fierce loyalty among his followers while preventing the pragmatic compromises that might have preserved some elements of Aztec autonomy through negotiated surrender. The emperor's refusal to consider any form of accommodation with Spanish demands reflected both noble character and tactical rigidity that may have eliminated possibilities for resistance strategies that could have achieved better outcomes for his people. The symbolic significance that Cuauhtémoc's reign acquired both during and after the conquest period transformed him into an embodiment of indigenous resistance and cultural pride, whose example would inspire subsequent generations of Mexican leaders seeking to define national identity in opposition to foreign domination. The emperor's choice of honor over survival became a foundational myth for Mexican nationalism, while providing a model of heroic leadership that transcended immediate military failure to achieve lasting influence on cultural and political development. The historical context that shaped Cuauhtémoc's options included the broader pattern of European expansion throughout the Americas, where indigenous societies that attempted accommodation with Spanish demands typically suffered cultural destruction and population decline regardless of their cooperation, suggesting that resistance may have been no less effective than submission in preserving essential elements of indigenous identity and social organization for future generations. The fortress city. The strategic transformation of Tenochtitlan from ceremonial capital into fortress city required unprecedented modifications to urban infrastructure while adapting civilian spaces for military purposes and converting the technological marvels of Aztec engineering into defensive systems capable of withstanding siege warfare conducted by enemies who possessed superior weapons but limited understanding of aquatic combat in the unique environment of Lake Texcoco. The causeway fortifications that became the primary focus of defensive planning included systematic destruction of bridges and sections of the stone roadways that connected the island capital to the mainland, creating water gaps that could only be crossed by swimming or portable bridges, while establishing defensive positions where warriors armed with projectile weapons could inflict maximum casualties on exposed enemies attempting to traverse open water under fire from concealed positions. The canal systems that had originally served commercial and transportation purposes were adapted for military use through the positioning of war canoes at strategic points where they could emerge suddenly to attack enemy forces while providing rapid communication and supply lines between different sectors of the defensive perimeter. The intimate knowledge of waterway navigation that Aztec defenders possessed provided crucial advantages during urban combat where Spanish cavalry and artillery proved less effective than anticipated. The pyramid temples that dominated Tenochtitlan's skyline were converted into observation posts and missile platforms where teams of warriors armed with slings, bows, and atlatl spear throwers could coordinate defensive fire while maintaining visual communication across the entire urban area. The elevated positions provided tactical advantages that partially compensated for Spanish superiority in individual weapons technology while enabling defenders to mass concentrated fire against specific targets. The residential districts that housed the urban population were systematically prepared for house-to-house combat through the stockpiling of weapons, construction of barricades, and creation of hidden passages that enabled defenders to move between buildings without exposure to enemy fire. The complex urban layout that had evolved over centuries of organic growth provided natural defensive advantages that could channel enemy movements into predetermined killing zones while offering multiple escape routes for defending forces. The food storage facilities that normally served commercial purposes were consolidated and expanded to support the civilian population during extended siege operations while implementing rationing systems that could stretch available supplies throughout a prolonged defensive campaign. The challenge of feeding hundreds of thousands of people trapped within the city required careful resource management and strict discipline that tested social cohesion under extreme stress. The weapon manufacturing workshops that had previously produced tools and ceremonial objects were converted to military production facilities where skilled craftsmen worked continuously to produce obsidian-edged clubs, projectile points, and other weapons necessary to arm the citizen soldiers who augmented professional warrior units during the defensive campaign. The quality and quantity of weapons produced demonstrated the remarkable industrial capabilities that Aztec civilization had achieved despite lacking metal technology. The medical facilities that served the wounded during siege operations included traditional healing centers staffed by physicians trained in herbal medicine and surgical procedures, while also improvised treatment areas where the enormous casualties of urban warfare could receive emergency care. The combination of epidemic disease and combat injuries created medical challenges that overwhelmed available resources while testing the limits of indigenous medical knowledge and therapeutic capabilities. The communication systems that coordinated defensive operations utilized combinations of drum signals, smoke messages, and runner networks that enabled rapid transmission of tactical information across the urban area, despite Spanish efforts to disrupt indigenous command and control systems. The sophistication of these communication methods reflected centuries of administrative experience while demonstrating adaptive capacity under extreme pressure. The civilian evacuation procedures that attempted to remove non-combatants from areas of intense fighting faced enormous logistical challenges while competing with military priorities for limited transportation resources and safe passage through combat zones. The decision to maintain civilian populations within the city, rather than attempting mass evacuation, reflected both strategic calculations about defensive manpower and practical limitations on movement through Spanish-controlled territory. The psychological warfare tactics that defenders employed included religious ceremonies designed to maintain morale while intimidating enemy forces through displays of cultural unity and spiritual determination that emphasized indigenous commitment to resistance regardless of material costs. The continuation of traditional rituals despite desperate circumstances demonstrated the central role of religious conviction in sustaining resistance motivation throughout the siege period. The resource conservation measures that stretched available supplies throughout the siege included recycling of materials, careful allocation of water and food, and innovative approaches to maintaining essential services despite the disruption of normal economic activities. The ability to sustain urban populations under siege conditions for months demonstrated remarkable organizational capabilities while revealing the social discipline that held Aztec society together during existential crisis. The intelligence operations that provided information about Spanish activities and intentions included networks of spies and informants who could monitor enemy movements while providing early warning of planned attacks or strategic changes. The effectiveness of indigenous intelligence gathering demonstrated sophisticated understanding of military requirements while providing tactical advantages that partially offset Spanish technological superiority during urban combat operations. The Eagles War Councils, the strategic planning that guided Aztec defensive operations, required unprecedented coordination between military commanders, religious leaders, and civilian administrators, while adapting traditional command structures to meet challenges that exceeded any previous experience in Mesoamerican warfare through integration of political, military, and spiritual considerations that reflected the cosmic significance of the struggle for imperial survival. The military leadership that surrounded Cuauhtémoc included experienced commanders who had served during previous conflicts with Spanish forces while understanding both the capabilities and limitations of European military technology based on direct combat experience during earlier phases of the conquest campaign. These veteran officers provided tactical expertise while adapting traditional Aztec military doctrine to meet unprecedented challenges posed by firearms, steel weapons, cavalry, and alliance warfare that combined European technology with indigenous manpower. The strategic assessment that shaped defensive planning recognized that Aztec forces could not match Spanish technological advantages in open-field combat while identifying urban warfare and aquatic operations as tactical environments where indigenous advantages in numbers, terrain knowledge, and motivation could overcome enemy superiority in individual weapons and equipment. The emphasis on defensive operations reflected realistic evaluation of relative capabilities rather than defeatist mentality or lack of offensive spirit. The alliance diplomacy that sought to maintain loyalty among tributary communities faced enormous challenges as Spanish encouraged rebellions had eliminated much of the imperial tribute system, while epidemic diseases had devastated populations that might otherwise have provided military assistance. The diplomatic efforts that continued despite desperate circumstances demonstrated Cuauhtémoc's understanding that imperial survival required broader indigenous unity against foreign invasion rather than merely local resistance by the capital city. The resource allocation decisions that distributed available manpower and materials between military and civilian needs required careful balancing of competing priorities while maintaining defensive capabilities and urban survival systems under conditions of increasing scarcity and external pressure. The emperor's role in these allocation decisions demonstrated both administrative competence and moral leadership that preserved social cohesion despite extreme stress and deteriorating conditions. The tactical innovations that adapted traditional Aztec military methods to siege warfare included development of urban combat techniques, coordination of land and water operations, and integration of civilian populations into defensive activities while maintaining discipline and effectiveness despite the amateur status of many participants who lacked professional military training but possessed motivation and local knowledge that enhanced their defensive value. The intelligence coordination that provided information about Spanish intentions and capabilities included systematic collection and analysis of information from multiple sources while maintaining communication with allied communities and resistance networks throughout central Mexico. The intelligence picture that emerged from these efforts enabled strategic planning while providing tactical advantages that partially compensated for Spanish superiority in conventional military capabilities. The supply line management that maintained ammunition and food supplies during siege operations required innovative approaches to logistics and transportation while utilizing the city's canal systems and remaining loyal communities to sustain defensive operations despite Spanish efforts to create complete isolation and starvation conditions that would force surrender without requiring costly assault operations against determined resistance. The medical planning that addressed casualty treatment and disease prevention included expansion of healing facilities while training additional medical personnel to handle the unprecedented volume of injuries and illness that resulted from combination of combat casualties and epidemic diseases that struck civilian and military populations simultaneously during the siege period. The religious coordination that maintained spiritual morale while seeking divine assistance for defensive operations included continuation of traditional ceremonies and consultation with priest astronomers whose spiritual authority and cosmic knowledge provided guidance for both tactical decisions and broader strategic planning that attempted to align military operations with divine will and cosmic purposes that transcended immediate, practical considerations. The civil defense organization that protected non-combatant populations while maintaining essential urban services required coordination between military authorities and civilian leaders who possessed administrative experience and local knowledge necessary for managing complex urban systems under emergency conditions that exceeded normal administrative procedures and resource allocation systems. The communication protocols that enabled effective command and control throughout the urban area included establishment of primary and backup systems for transmitting orders and receiving reports while maintaining security against Spanish intelligence gathering and ensuring reliable coordination despite enemy efforts to disrupt indigenous command structures through targeted attacks on leadership positions and communication facilities. The contingency planning that prepared alternative strategies for different scenarios included development of evacuation procedures, fallback positions, and continuation strategies that could maintain resistance even after the fall of the capital city while preserving leadership and organizational capabilities that might enable future resistance efforts from alternative bases outside Spanish-controlled territory. The Siege of Desperation. Spanish siege operations that surrounded Tenochtitlan beginning in May 1521 represented the largest military operation in the history of the Americas up to that time, while combining European siege techniques with indigenous manpower and local knowledge to create unprecedented pressure on the defending city through coordinated attacks that exploited both technological advantages and numerical superiority achieved through extensive alliance building among enemies of Aztec rule. The blockade tactics that attempted to starve the city into submission faced significant challenges due to the aquatic environment that enabled defenders to maintain some supply lines through canal systems and small boat operations that could evade Spanish naval patrols while providing essential resources and communication links with allied communities that remained loyal to imperial authority despite enormous pressure to join the anti-Aztec coalition. The artillery bombardment that targeted defensive positions in civilian areas demonstrated Spanish technological advantages while revealing the limitations of European military equipment in urban environments where targets were dispersed and protected by substantial architectural barriers that could absorb significant damage without eliminating defensive capabilities or breaking civilian morale that sustained resistance throughout months of constant pressure and material degradation. The assault operations that attempted to establish footholds within the city through coordinated attacks along multiple axes met fierce resistance from defenders who utilized their intimate knowledge of urban layout to conduct tactical withdrawals while inflicting maximum casualties on exposed attackers who found themselves fighting in unfamiliar terrain against enemies who could appear and disappear through hidden passages and concealed positions. The naval warfare that characterized combat on Lake Texcoco included Spanish brigantines armed with artillery and fighting against Aztec war canoes whose superior maneuverability and local piloting expertise enabled effective harassment operations while demonstrating that technological advantages could be neutralized through tactical innovation and exploitation of environmental factors that favored indigenous operational methods and equipment capabilities. The disease warfare that accompanied military operations included both deliberate and accidental transmission of epidemic illnesses that devastated defending populations while creating humanitarian crises that complicated military planning and resource allocation decisions. The differential impact of diseases on Spanish and indigenous populations provided significant advantages for attacking forces while undermining defensive capabilities through elimination of experienced personnel and disruption of social systems. The psychological warfare that attempted to break civilian morale included deliberate targeting of religious sites and cultural symbols while conducting public executions and displays of captured prisoners designed to demonstrate Spanish power and inevitability of defeat. These tactics often backfired by strengthening indigenous determination to resist rather than submit to forces that clearly intended cultural destruction rather than merely political domination. The alliance warfare that brought tens of thousands of indigenous warriors to fight alongside Spanish forces represented the most significant factor in determining siege outcomes, while demonstrating the effectiveness of Spanish diplomatic strategy that exploited resentments against Aztec tribute obligations and imperial administration. The participation of traditional enemies in siege operations eliminated any possibility of external relief while ensuring that defenders would face overwhelming numerical disadvantages. The urban combat that characterized the final phases of siege operations included house-to-house fighting that negated many Spanish technological advantages while exposing European soldiers to continuous danger from hidden defenders who possessed superior knowledge of local terrain and could coordinate defensive operations through established communication systems and supply networks that maintained effectiveness despite enormous pressure and material constraints. The civilian casualties that mounted throughout the siege period included deaths from disease, starvation, and military action, while creating moral challenges for defenders who witnessed the suffering of non-combatant populations without possessing the capability to prevent humanitarian disasters that resulted from their decision to continue resistance rather than negotiate surrender terms that might have preserved civilian lives at the cost of political and cultural independence. The resource depletion that affected both attacking and defending forces included consumption of ammunition, food, and medical supplies while testing the logistical capabilities of siege operations that required sustained support for enormous military forces operating far from established bases and supply systems. The economic costs of prolonged siege operations strained Spanish colonial resources while demonstrating the enormous investment required for conquest of determined resistance. The tactical adaptation that both sides employed throughout the siege period included development of new combat techniques, modification of equipment and weapon systems, and innovation in command and control procedures that reflected learning processes and adaptive capacity under extreme pressure, while revealing the dynamic nature of military technology and organizational development during extended combat operations. The final stand, the last days of Tenochtitlan, witnessed scenes of heroism and tragedy that would resonate through Mexican history as Cuauhtémoc and his remaining warriors fought a desperate delaying action through the rubble-filled streets of their dying capital, while civilians huddled in ruins where the bodies of the dead provided grim testimony to the cost of choosing honor over survival in the face of overwhelming odds and inevitable defeat. The urban combat that characterized the final assault included hand-to-hand fighting in individual buildings and courtyards, where Aztec warriors continued resistance despite being outnumbered and outgunned, while Spanish and Allied forces advanced methodically through defensive positions that had been prepared over months of siege operations. The intensity of fighting reached levels that shocked even experienced Spanish veterans who had participated in European wars and previous American conquests. The civilian evacuation attempts that occurred during the final days reflected last-minute efforts to save non-combatant populations from the massacre and enslavement that typically followed Spanish conquest operations, while demonstrating the logistical challenges of moving large numbers of people through combat zones where any movement attracted hostile fire from multiple directions. The failure of most evacuation efforts resulted in enormous civilian casualties that would haunt Spanish consciences and indigenous memories for generations. The Emperor's personal involvement in combat operations during the final phase demonstrated his commitment to sharing the risks faced by his warriors while maintaining morale through visible leadership and personal courage that inspired continued resistance despite hopeless circumstances. Cuauhtémoc's presence in forward positions exposed him to constant danger while providing psychological support for defenders who might otherwise have lost the will to continue fighting against impossible odds. The ammunition shortage that plagued defenders during the final battle included depletion of obsidian points, stones for slings, and other projectile weapons, while forcing warriors to rely increasingly on hand-to-hand combat, where Spanish advantages in armor and steel weapons became more pronounced. The resourcefulness demonstrated by defenders in improvising weapons and recycling materials reflected both practical ingenuity and desperate determination to continue resistance regardless of material limitations. The communication breakdown that occurred during final assault operations included disruption of command systems and coordination mechanisms that had previously enabled effective defensive operations while isolating different sectors of resistance from central authority and mutual support. The fragmentation of defensive operations into isolated pockets of resistance eliminated possibilities for coordinated tactical responses while enabling Spanish forces to defeat defenders piecemeal through concentration of superior forces. The medical crisis that accompanied final combat operations included overwhelming numbers of wounded requiring treatment, while medical facilities were destroyed or captured and medical personnel were killed or fled to safety. The inability to provide adequate medical care for casualties created additional demoralization among defenders while demonstrating the human costs of resistance that extended beyond immediate combat deaths to include suffering from untreated wounds and preventable complications. The food shortage that reached crisis levels during final siege phase included complete depletion of stored supplies while elimination of external food sources through Spanish control of supply routes. The starvation that affected both military and civilian populations weakened physical resistance while creating moral dilemmas for leaders who witnessed the suffering of their people without possessing means to alleviate humanitarian disasters that resulted from their strategic decisions. The religious ceremonies that continued despite desperate circumstances included traditional rituals designed to maintain divine support while providing psychological comfort for defenders facing almost certain death. The persistence of ceremonial activities demonstrated the central role of spiritual conviction in sustaining resistance motivation while revealing the depth of cultural commitment that drove indigenous determination to preserve traditional ways of life regardless of material costs or survival prospects. The capture attempts that focused on seizing Cuauhtémoc alive reflected Spanish recognition of his symbolic importance while offering possibilities for ending resistance through elimination or co-optation of indigenous leadership. The emperor's successful evasion of multiple capture attempts demonstrated both personal courage and tactical awareness, while prolonging resistance operations beyond their natural termination point through continued inspirational leadership that maintained fighting spirit among demoralized defenders. The final assault that achieved Spanish breakthrough included coordinated attacks that overwhelmed remaining defensive positions while eliminating organized resistance throughout most of the urban area. The systematic nature of final operations demonstrated Spanish tactical competence while revealing the inevitability of outcome that had been predetermined by enormous disparities in resources, technology, and allied support that no amount of courage or determination could overcome through purely military means. The escape attempt that led to Cuauhtémoc's capture occurred during the emperor's desperate effort to reach the mainland where loyal forces might have enabled continued resistance from mountain strongholds outside Spanish control. The interception of the imperial canoe by Spanish brigantines eliminated the last possibility for continuation of organized resistance while providing Spanish forces with their most valuable prisoner whose cooperation might facilitate pacification of remaining hostile territories. The price of honor. The capture of Emperor Cuauhtémoc on August 13, 1521, marked not merely the end of military resistance, but the beginning of a tragic epilogue that would transform the young warrior emperor from living symbol of indigenous defiance into martyred embodiment of cultural resistance, whose suffering and death would inspire centuries of Mexican struggle against foreign domination and internal oppression. The initial Spanish treatment of the captured emperor reflected complex European attitudes toward indigenous nobility that combined grudging respect for royal status with practical considerations about the utility of cooperative indigenous leadership in facilitating colonial administration and economic exploitation. Cortés initially provided Cuauhtémoc with quarters appropriate to his rank while attempting to secure his cooperation in ending remaining resistance and revealing the location of imperial treasures that Spanish forces had been unable to locate despite extensive searches. The interrogations procedures that Spanish forces employed in their attempts to extract information about hidden wealth demonstrated the fundamental misconceptions that Europeans possessed regarding Aztec imperial administration and the nature of indigenous wealth systems that emphasized artistic and symbolic value rather than mere accumulation of precious metals. The Spanish assumption that vast hordes of gold and silver must exist somewhere within the conquered territories reflected European economic thinking rather than accurate understanding of Mesoamerican value systems. The torture sessions that Spanish forces conducted when cooperative interrogation methods failed to produce desired information represented one of the most shameful episodes of the conquest period, while revealing the extremes to which European avarice and frustration could drive allegedly civilized conquistadors who possessed legal and religious justifications for their actions, but lacked moral constraints that might have limited their brutality against defenseless prisoners. The physical suffering that Cuauhtémoc endured during Spanish torture included having his feet burned with oil while being subjected to other forms of physical abuse designed to break his resistance and force revelation of treasure locations that may never have existed in the forms that Spanish imagination had constructed. The emperor's ability to endure extreme pain without betraying whatever secrets he possessed demonstrated character strength that impressed even his tormentors while earning historical recognition as embodiment of heroic resistance. The psychological dimensions of Cuauhtémoc's suffering included witnessing the torture of his companions and advisors while being forced to watch the systematic destruction of his capital city and the enslavement of his people by forces that had initially claimed to seek only peaceful trade relationships and religious conversion rather than complete conquest and cultural elimination. The emotional trauma of witnessing civilizational collapse while being powerless to prevent it added spiritual agony to physical suffering. The diplomatic manipulation that Spanish authorities attempted included offers of cooperation and accommodation that might have preserved some semblance of indigenous authority under colonial supervision, while providing Cuauhtémoc with alternatives to continued resistance that could theoretically have preserved his people's welfare at the cost of political independence and cultural autonomy. The emperor's rejection of these offers reflected both personal principle and realistic assessment of Spanish intentions. The religious pressure that colonial authorities applied included forced attendance at Christian religious services while subjecting the emperor to evangelical preaching, designed to secure conversion that would legitimize Spanish authority and provide propaganda value for broader missionary activities. The combination of religious coercion with political and physical pressure demonstrated the comprehensive nature of Spanish cultural assault against indigenous identity and traditional belief systems. The legal proceedings that eventually led to Cuauhtémoc's execution included trumped-up charges of plotting rebellion against Spanish authority, while the evidence for such conspiracy remained questionable and may have been fabricated to justify elimination of potential resistance leadership. The legal framework that Spanish authorities constructed provided appearance of judicial process while reaching predetermined conclusions that served colonial political needs rather than principles of justice. The symbolic significance that Cuauhtémoc's execution acquired both immediately and over subsequent centuries transformed his death from simple elimination of troublesome prisoner into foundational myth of Mexican national identity that connected resistance to foreign domination with cultural authenticity and moral authority. The martyrdom narrative that developed around his execution provided inspirational model for subsequent generations of Mexican leaders seeking to legitimate opposition movements through identification with indigenous heroic tradition. The historical debate that surrounds the circumstances of Cuauhtémoc's execution includes conflicting Spanish and indigenous accounts that reflect different perspectives on conquest morality and legal justification, while revealing the propaganda requirements that shaped colonial historical narratives designed to minimize Spanish culpability for obvious injustices perpetrated against indigenous populations who possessed legitimate claims to territorial sovereignty and cultural autonomy. The cultural legacy that emerged from Cuauhtémoc's resistance and martyrdom included artistic, literary, and political expressions that preserved memory of indigenous heroism while providing symbols of resistance that could inspire later movements for independence, social justice, and cultural revival throughout Mexican history. The emperor's transformation from historical figure into mythological hero demonstrated the power of suffering and sacrifice to transcend immediate political failure while achieving lasting influence on cultural and national development. The contemporary relevance that Cuauhtémoc's example possesses includes his demonstration that moral victory can emerge from military defeat when leaders choose principle over expedience while accepting personal sacrifice for collective welfare and cultural preservation. His commitment to honor over survival provides timeless model of leadership integrity that remains relevant for contemporary challenges involving resistance to oppression and preservation of cultural identity against overwhelming pressure for assimilation or accommodation. The Eagle's Flight. Final execution of Cuauhtémoc in 1525 during Cortés's expedition to Honduras eliminated not merely the last legitimate claimant to Aztec imperial authority, but also destroyed the final possibility that indigenous political leadership might emerge from colonial accommodation to challenge European domination through hybrid arrangements that preserved essential elements of traditional culture while adapting to colonial realities and opportunities for gradual autonomy restoration. The circumstances that led to Cuauhtémoc's death included Spanish fears of indigenous rebellion during a dangerous expedition through hostile territory, where European forces were vastly outnumbered and dependent upon indigenous guides and porters, whose loyalty remained questionable, while communication with colonial bases was impossible and reinforcement unavailable in case of coordinated uprising that might eliminate Spanish leadership and strand survivors in wilderness areas beyond effective rescue or support operations. The charges that Spanish authorities used to justify execution included accusations of conspiracy and rebellion planning that may have been fabricated or exaggerated to provide legal pretext for elimination of potential resistance leadership, whose mere presence among expedition members created security concerns and psychological pressure that undermined Spanish confidence and operational effectiveness during extended operations in unfamiliar and potentially hostile territory where any organized resistance could prove fatal. The legal proceedings that preceded execution included hastily conducted hearings that provided appearance of judicial process while reaching predetermined conclusions based on political necessity rather than credible evidence or adherence to established legal procedures that might have protected indigenous rights or provided genuine opportunities for defense against accusations that carried death penalties. The judicial formalities demonstrated Spanish concern for legal legitimacy while revealing the inadequacy of colonial legal systems for protecting indigenous interests. The witness accounts that documented execution proceedings included both Spanish and indigenous perspectives that provided conflicting interpretations of events while reflecting different cultural understandings of justice, authority, and moral responsibility during crisis situations that tested legal and ethical frameworks under extreme pressure. The discrepancies between accounts revealed the challenges of reconstructing historical events when primary sources possessed obvious biases and conflicting motivations for accuracy versus propaganda. The symbolic dimensions of Cuauhtémoc's execution included its function as final elimination of indigenous imperial authority, while demonstrating Spanish willingness to employ extreme measures against any potential challenge to colonial supremacy, regardless of legal niceties or moral considerations that might constrain violence against defenseless prisoners who possessed symbolic rather than practical threat value. The execution served warning purposes for other indigenous leaders who might consider resistance activities. The immediate consequences of execution included elimination of indigenous hopes for political restoration while demonstrating the futility of accommodation, strategies that had failed to provide security even for cooperative former enemies who had accepted colonial authority and participated in Spanish operations. The death proved that submission offered no guarantees of survival, while resistance at least preserved dignity and provided inspirational examples for future generations despite immediate failure to achieve political objectives. The historical significance that attached to Cuauhtémoc's death included its role in completing the conquest process while eliminating the last legitimate representative of pre-Columbian political authority who might have served as focal point for indigenous resistance movements or alternative political arrangements that could have challenged colonial monopoly on legitimate authority. The execution represented final closure of possibilities for hybrid political systems that might have preserved indigenous autonomy within colonial frameworks. The mythological transformation that converted Cuauhtémoc from historical figure into national symbol included artistic and literary treatments that emphasized heroic resistance while minimizing the practical failure of his strategies and the human costs of his uncompromising approach to Spanish demands. The heroic narrative that emerged from his death provided inspirational model while obscuring complex realities of conquest period politics and the difficult choices faced by indigenous leaders during civilizational crisis. The political exploitation of Cuauhtémoc's memory by subsequent Mexican independence movements included utilization of his example to legitimize resistance against foreign domination while connecting contemporary political struggles to authentic indigenous tradition that predated colonial influences and European cultural impositions. The appropriation of his symbolic value for nationalist purposes demonstrated both respect for indigenous heroism and tendency to subordinate historical accuracy to political utility and ideological requirements. The cultural preservation that resulted from memory of Cuauhtémoc's resistance included maintenance of indigenous identity concepts and resistance narratives that provided alternative frameworks for understanding Mexican history and national character in opposition to colonial and European interpretive models that minimized indigenous contributions and capabilities. The preservation of his memory served cultural survival functions while inspiring continued resistance to assimilation pressures and cultural homogenization. The contemporary relevance that Cuauhtémoc's example maintains includes its demonstration of leadership principles and moral courage that transcend specific historical circumstances while providing models for resistance to oppression and defense of cultural identity that remain applicable to modern challenges involving cultural survival, political autonomy, or resistance to dominant systems that threaten indigenous values and community integrity. The eternal flight of the descending eagle thus represents not historical failure, but spiritual victory that transforms physical defeat into moral triumph while demonstrating that authentic leadership sometimes requires accepting ultimate sacrifice for principles that transcend personal survival and immediate political success. In choosing honor over accommodation, resistance over submission, and cultural integrity over individual preservation, Cuauhtémoc achieved immortality through martyrdom while providing permanent inspiration for all subsequent struggles against injustice and oppression. Through understanding his final stand, we glimpse both the tragic costs of uncompromising resistance and the eternal value of moral courage that refuses to purchase survival through betrayal of fundamental principles and cultural identity. The young emperor who chose death over dishonor became something greater than any living ruler could achieve, an eternal symbol of indigenous resistance and cultural pride that continues to inspire centuries after his physical death, while demonstrating that some victories can only be achieved through apparent defeat when the alternative is spiritual surrender and cultural extinction. In the end, Cuauhtémoc's legacy reminds us that leadership sometimes requires accepting impossible choices while maintaining integrity regardless of consequences, that cultural survival may depend upon individual sacrifice, and that honor can triumph over force when heroes choose principles over preservation. The descending eagle's flight carries him not toward earth but toward eternal remembrance as embodiment of resistance, dignity, and cultural authenticity that no conquest can destroy and no oppression can eliminate from human memory and inspiration.